one of the reasons I wrote the book is the disconnect between what I learned in my 80 to 90 trips and dealing with hundreds of Chinese people from different walks of life, and the description of the Chinese as having limited freedoms, of being oppressed, of being unhappy, the description of government officials as being self-interested and not really caring at the people was completely the opposite of all of my experiences. So a motivation for me in writing the book was really just to go back to the history and the culture of the US and China and show how these two countries have evolved on very different underlying assumptions and backgrounds, which is why I titled the book Powerful, Different, Equal. Because a lot of the criticism of China by the West is judging China by Western standards. And the reality, as we all know, is the Chinese culture and history go back many, many more centuries than the West does, but they were based on some fundamentally different premises. You know, one of the huge differences between the US and China that's very fundamental, China has always been a collectivist society. So when you go back to Confucian values, its first is the family, and that's always been preeminent in China. Second is commitment to society and the country. And individuals who in the US we make number one, the individual's role in China is largely self-improvement through education, so you can better support your family and society. And that's totally different from the US, where given the lack of individual rights in Europe, the Constitution was set to pay enormous attention to individual freedoms baked into the Bill of Rights. And yet we have enormous amount of press coverage focused on the dissidents in China who are minuscule in terms of the number. And when you talk to most Chinese people about dissidents, their attitude is the only thing you really can't do as an individual is to commit a crime or organize against the government. And the reality is the Chinese people are very comfortable with those constraints, and therefore the whole notion of dissidence is a huge disconnect between the US and China. We tend to focus attention on every individual, and if an individual wants to protest against the government, that's their right. It's not their right in China. And the people in China are fine with that. So I then go from human rights to, you know, a couple of other areas. The definition of democracy. I think in the US, the definition of democracy is an electoral democracy. And yet only 60% of the people vote. The definition of democracy in China is different, which is to be responsive to the people. And if you look at the 5-year planning process in China, you see an enormous amount of input that's gathered from people in China, and you see priorities that reflect what the will of the people are. So when a lot of people were upset with the level of pollution in the major cities, they were loud and clear on that dimension, and China has since become, you know, one of the world's leaders in producing renewable energy, electric trains, and more recently has cut back pretty significantly the amount of pollution in the major cities. So it's a different definition. I don't take a point of view in the book that there's a right or a wrong answer to democracy, but it's overly simplistic for the West to say we are democratic in the West and China is not. China has a different definition, and many people are comfortable that if you're truly responsible to the people, that would be the ultimate test that anybody ought to hold a government to. So I set out to, you know, organize the book around what really are the high tension themes. So I started with what will not change. So I said, for example, China has been a strong centrally managed government going back thousands of years. That will not change. The government has been run over that period of time, largely as a meritocracy, but certainly since the reform and opening up period under Deng, it's clearly a meritocracy with examinations that are very demanding at successive levels of government. So I've said what will not change is that the best and the brightest in China aspire to government service, and that when you meet people in the government, and I've met many, they are highly educated, they're very thoughtful, and based on my experiences, their primary objective is the well-being of the Chinese people. So I start, and then I also say, if you look at the American side, just as Americans should not expect China to become a democracy, there's no interest in that whatsoever, and there's nothing in their history that suggests that. No one in China should expect that the U.S. will remain other than a democracy. The economy, because I think everyone knows that the economic environment in the country, it very much determines the well-being and attitudes of the people. So just as everyone watches closely economic growth in China as a measure of how satisfied the people are, the same is true in the United States. And whenever we've gone through periods of recessions, typically in the US, there's a change in government. So I went through the economy, I went through human rights. In human rights, I basically make the point that if you go back not very long ago, back to the late 1970s when Deng took over, you had the Euqal system that basically said you were told what apartment you would live in, what job you would have, what you would be paid. If you wanted to travel to another village, you need government approval. And virtually all of those constraints are gone. And that's why when I talk to young people today from China, they basically say we have freedom to live where we want to live. We have freedom to work where we want to work. If we want to be educated in another part of the world, we have freedom to do that. So when I push them on, well, what don't you have freedom to do? And most of them come back and say, I can't think of anything. So there's very little appreciation in the US that, in fact, the degrees of freedom in China have increased dramatically in a relatively short period of time. But then I also point out that if you look at freedoms in the US, it's not always been an easy story. So certainly the treatment of the Indians in America, who really were driven out, and many of them died from not only diseases, but also just violence, and the treatment of minorities in the US, which has taken many years to get to the point where we are today. But if you think about slaves that were brought over in the early 1600s, and it really took the Civil War for them to be given legal rights in terms of the right to vote and non-discrimination laws. But those laws were really not enforced until roughly 100 years later. And so I think for the US to criticize China in terms of human rights is a very simplistic view of the world.